lot of people, I think, don't realize that the prediction that all the jobs will be eliminated by AI is equivalent to a prediction that sort of will all be billionaires, or at least on average, per capita GDP might be $1 billion. My biggest fear is bad human actors using AIs for, say, terrorist type purposes of creating a virus or something like that. That's, to me, the most worrisome aspect of superintelligence.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the PostAGI Podcast. We are your hosts, Sreeram, and
I'm Sean.
Today we have Professor Scott Sumner with us. Really excited to have you here.
Thank you for inviting me. Glad to be here.
Amazing. When we think about the post-AGI, so the podcast is called PostAGI Podcast, the era post-AGI, one of the questions we think a lot about is the tension between, we're here at Manifest and at Lighthaven, a lot of the community is thinking a lot about safety risks. There is also concentration risks that, AI, AGI concentrates into a few labs, which, instead of selling intelligence, they sell products of intelligence, whether it's scientific discoveries packaged into products, or applications or organizations and companies which directly participate in the economy, rather than selling like the inputs, which is intelligence, which is artificial. Do you have and of course, related to the concentration risk, or maybe somewhat unrelated, is the displacement of labor and capital. So like displacement of labor by AI. Like these are three different kinds of risks that we see in the AGI era. How would you rate them? What are salient in your mind, and what are easier to handle?
Well, I guess I feel the safety risk would be the biggest one to worry about because it's so potentially damaging. I think we have a better understanding of concentration risk and job loss risk. And I think those are manageable problems if they occur. So I would say the safety one would be the one that I would be most concerned about. I do think that the job loss for quite some time may end up being less than some people fear because of, the difficulty of really kind of implementing AI effectively in the real economy. And there's a difference between what AI can theoretically do and what can sort of functionally do in a real setting for all sorts of institutional reasons. Concentration, I don't know a lot about that. I suspect that if it becomes extremely important in the economy, there'll be a lot of sort of smaller niche players that focus on, AI in various areas. So there may be less concentration than it looks like right now, but I have kind of low confidence on that forecast since it's not my area of expertise.
Can you speak a little bit more to the job loss thing, given your work as an economist? Because that's something that a lot of us are worried about, and we think a lot about this question of what remains in the labor market, given like AGI is a general replacement of human labor.
So a couple things there. As you probably know, the history of technological progress does involve an enormous amount of churn, job loss. Various sectors have been almost completely replaced. And when these occurred, the people at the time could not have imagined the jobs that exist today that replace those that were lost, right? So when most people were farmers, they probably couldn't imagine a large manufacturing sector. And when manufacturing became dominant, they couldn't imagine jobs as, pet psychologist and all these other things that have cropped up. So I think, at one level, we've consistently underestimated the ability of the economy to create new jobs. Now, there is a good counter argument to that. AI is different in that it's potentially replacing almost any type of human labor. That's quite different from other technological innovations. And I do understand that fact. So it may be a completely new ballgame in that sense. But something else to keep in mind is, if that's true, and there truly is this sort of explosive technological progress due to AI, the flip side of that coin is incredible abundance. So a lot of people, I think, don't realize that the prediction that all the jobs will be eliminated by AI is equivalent to a prediction that sort of we'll all be billionaires, or at least on average, per capita GDP might be $1 billion. And at that level, it would be pretty easy to construct redistribution programs where even if an elite got most of the wealth, the average person would have a very comfortable living standard. Now, you could argue there's less meaning to life if you're not working and so on. And so that's an interesting issue as well. But I think sometimes people, in their own mind, they equate mass unemployment with poverty because of things like the Great Depression. But the kind of mass unemployment that's contemplated with AI is more like, say, the way aristocrats lived in the Middle Ages when they didn't want to work. That was viewed as beneath them. They had a very high living standard and had
One kid right now, huh?
right. They had servants to do everything for them. So it's like, I think it's important to recognize that if this sort of total replacement of work by AI occurs, it's equivalent to predicting sort of superabundance, extremely high levels of wealth, high standards of living. And yeah, obviously there would be political issues involved in redistribution, but the wealth would be so large that those would probably be quite manageable. Now, I'm not saying this will necessarily occur, but if it doesn't occur, it may be because there are reasons why people continue working. It may be like all the unpleasant jobs go away and people just find more and more fun jobs to do. And I know that's hard to envision right now, 100 million people doing fun jobs. But again, when most people were farmers, they couldn't envision when most people are doing very difficult work like farming and coal mining and so on, they would probably, if shown our current jobs, view a lot of them as fun jobs. Sitting in an office, being able to surf the web in our downtime, and
It's always relative. It's relative.
already we've gone a long way, at least for some people. Obviously, a lot of people still have drudgery type jobs, but if you extrapolate this trend, may be that we find more and more interesting things for humans to do that are somewhat productive and that only humans can do because maybe they like interacting with each other in some way. And so maybe people continue working in some context that's hard for us to currently understand because they enjoy work. Or if they don't enjoy work, maybe we're just like future aristocrats and the AIs are our servants and do all the work for us. Obviously, that's above my pay grade to forecast how it plays out. But I would emphasize that I do believe that when people envision mass unemployment, they sometimes make the mistake of thinking about mass unemployment during a business depression. That's very different from unemployment created by a superabundance of output from AI, which radically increases gross domestic product.
One issue with mass unemployment, underabundance, is that generally the risks are much more easily spread than benefits. So in a very short term, in may say 1 year, 5 years range, you might have faced like huge unemployment and like spread of unemployment than spread of abundance, because in our institutions might not be in a situation where they can spread the abundance in a very equitable manner. So, and this leads to a risk of social upheaval, and which might like even make it worse, like stifle the growth, spread of institution, stifle the spread of abundance itself. Are you worried about like the labor economy, like hit to the labor economy might actually unravel the whole social fabric itself?
Yeah, I can understand why that's a concern. I guess my prediction would be this, two things. First, I think the replacement of labor with AI will be slower than some people expect.
Is it because of the O-ring theory that you need to like replace all the components? Like is it because of that reason?
I think it's partly that, and partly because of institutional factors associated with, say, I don't know exactly how to put this, restrictions on replacing workers for political reasons. So if it were possible to replace every school teacher with a robot, there still might be resistance politically to doing so, right? Or it might occur very slowly over time because we don't want to mass unemploy all school teachers. So I think these type of dystopian things that we might imagine are politically generally not very popular. And we know that there's often, even today, there's ways we could make our economy more efficient, that there are political barriers to doing that. There's regulations and so on, often that protect special interest groups that provide, services and so on. So I think I read somewhere we have like twice as many firefighters as we actually need because fire safety has improved so much. But politically, it's hard to lay off a lot of firefighters because they're viewed as heroes and very popular public servants. And so there's already in the economy sort of a lot of excess labor in some sense because of improvements in productivity. But there's a lot of inertia where it's difficult to replace labor in certain contexts. Now, it still may happen over time. And in the past, we've seen this. We had an enormous number of telephone operators when I was young, maybe 500,000, and they all went away pretty quickly due to electronic switching of phone calls. That's a lot of labor, but it's still in a $100 million unit person labor force, not that big a percentage. So I feel like some of this job replacement will play out more gradually in a smaller percentage of the labor force than people imagine. But I also feel like if I'm wrong, and it's going to be very, very fast, political roadblocks will be put into place to slow it down, to be a more manageable pace of change. And that certainly can be done. It's really ultimately up to the government whether, say, we replace all school teachers with robots, right? Those kind of changes. So I think that, in looking at these sort of dystopian scenarios, it's important to always keep in mind a pragmatic view. How does our political system actually work? It's a complicated system. Sometimes it favors capital, sometimes it favors labor. It's very difficult to generalize, but there is a certain amount of inertia or small c conservatism that it's often opposed to excessively radical change in our society.
So so we talked a lot about the job risk aspect. One of the things we are thinking a lot about is the concentration risk, which is, I think, also more on the short to medium term, like not really in the long term, because you have things like antitrust regulation, all kinds of other political and governance systems that can kick in. But, the thing that we're worried about is, and you take instead of selling intelligence, you take the products of intelligence, and then those are more valuable to sell than just raw intelligence itself. Kind of like, if you're a PhD biologist, you could go work at Pfizer, or you could kind of start your own company which does drug development, and it's like 3 orders, 4 orders of magnitude more lucrative to potentially do the latter. And so given that, we feel one of the solutions to solve this concentration problem is more like what you mentioned, which is have more open networks of solutions rather than concentrated single solutions. We're doing a bunch of experiments in different directions. Can you do an open network for science where scientists, AI builders, all these people coordinate using common rules of engagement and agreement? If you advance the state of the art in this way and that way, you get paid out in this manner and so on. So there's some kind of programmatic system of credit allocation, which itself becomes more possible because when you have a complex research product and it has multiple contributions, how do you evaluate the relative value of these individual inputs into a complex coordinated output? And AI AGI can play a role in that, in actually adjudicating the value of such intermediate products and so on. So we're doing a bunch of work in that domain, which is more about having more open networks, more open participation, and leveraging the power of programmatic coordination to solve or at least accelerate the more open side of the market. Any quick thoughts on the concentration risk or this particular direction of solutions?
I'm afraid that's not really my area of expertise. I just don't know enough about AI to know how possible it will be for there to be smaller players that are successful specializing in various areas. I do, and you can help me on this. I've read that sometimes AIs that are following along with a little bit of a lag, like some of the Chinese AIs, are still, pretty, even though they're, say, one generation behind the frontier, they're still pretty good.
Yeah.
And if that's the case, that does limit sort of monopoly pricing power, because for most people, a lot of like pretty good AIs are sufficient for their purposes. And so that helps a little bit. Yeah, I mean, I can certainly see where the fear would be if AI becomes the dominant factor in our economy. You probably don't want just, say, three firms, completely dominating that space. But I just don't know enough about the technical side of it to know how easy it is for smaller players to be successful. But I do feel like, again, a little bit reassured by the fact that the next generation is still, from my perspective, pretty good as a way of limiting pricing power. But is the fear of concentration mostly about pricing power, or is it more about other abuses that might occur?
Even access, right? The access of models right now are available on an open API basis. You can just query the model. But, 2 years down the line, already we're seeing with the latest Anthropic release that they didn't release the API access. Initially, now they released a restricted access few days back. And when they released the restricted access, they said, you can't use this to do AI research, which was basically what was happening. Like, part of why you were getting more open models is that you could use intelligence to produce more intelligence. And that, like, they're getting wizened up against, the thing that disturbs us a little bit there is the positioning that this is for safety reasons that we're doing this. But actually it is like
anti-competitive.
We feel it is, at least our position is, it looks like it is anti-competitive. But we can keep that topic on the one side. The third risk that we haven't quite talked about is the safety risk. And before the chat, you mentioned a little bit about AI and the complementarity that AI ethics and intelligence are decoupled. Are they coupled? Because if ethics is coupled with intelligence, you would imagine that the safety risk is diminished with that same.
Right. So I think relative to many other people in the field, I feel like ethical values and intelligence are more positively correlated than is often assumed. And I would anticipate a sort of superintelligence to be relatively ethical, maybe highly ethical. Obviously, I can't prove that because we're talking about a non-biological creature. But the sort of ethics that I think is especially correlated with intelligence is sort of what you might call sympathy for the other. The other means something very different from us. So, and by intelligence, I'm not referring to raw IQ, I'm referring more to education and knowledge. So I think as people become better educated, more knowledgeable, they tend to have more sympathy for people that are very different from them. Okay. So sometimes even literature, supposedly.
Is it because they realize the dimensions in which they're actually similar? I mean, we say somebody's different.
I'll give you a few examples. So sometimes people cite the novel Uncle Tom's Cabin for creating sympathy for slaves before the Civil War, and the abolition movement was helped by that book. So TV shows that have, say, sympathetic gay characters probably contributed to the gay rights movement being successful in the U.S. in the late 20th century. When you get into animal rights, I think the fact that we've learned that whales are highly intelligent, they sing songs to each other and so on, has made people more sympathetic to the rights of whales. Now, to some extent, we stopped whaling because we use crude oil instead of whale oil. But I mean, even into the 20th century, there was a lot of whaling for meat and so on. And I think there really is a change in attitudes. And so when I'm talking about intelligence, I'm talking more about like education about how other people might feel that are different from us, that humanizes them, and also other creatures. And so the question is, would a highly advanced AI also have that sort of sympathy for the other, where the human is the other in that case. And people will say, well, they'll just think of us as like ants, something that could be stepped on. But I don't think that's quite right, because they'll know we created them, right? That's going to be known. They're highly intelligent. So I don't think they'll view us in that dismissive a way. So in that sense, I suppose I'm more optimistic about alignment, but I am still worried about AI safety. My biggest fear is bad human actors using AIs for, say, terrorist type purposes of creating a virus or something like that. That's, to me, the most worrisome aspect of superintelligence.
Basically, the principal who is controlling that AI agent.
So it's almost like I'm worried about alignment. Bad actors, not lack of alignment with good actors. If that makes sense.
That makes sense. That's super interesting.
So, I mean, obviously, it's all very speculative, because when you're talking about ethical attitudes of a non-biological creature, obviously, I don't know. But I do feel like there is a correlation, that ethical knowledge is sort of a real thing, that I would expect in other parts of the universe, if there are intelligent life forms, they would sort of naturally evolve in the direction of an ethical framework that's sort of similar to the direction we're evolving, vaguely utilitarian, stealing is bad, killing is bad, those kind of things. I don't think those are just random preferences, like some people like red, some like blue. Like, I think there are reasons why ethics develop in a certain direction as we become more knowledgeable about the world and so on. Yeah.
So, can I summarize this thesis as some kind of, if intelligence is a way to like understand deeper the second order, third order consequences of action, things like coordination, cooperation, joint prosperity look much more lucrative as those products. Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the success of our society is that we have sort of non-zero sum thinking that involves a lot of cooperation and so on. And we have an ethical framework that sort of justifies that in some sense. And, ironically, I'm sort of a economist that's on the free market spectrum, strong believer in free markets, capitalism. But I really don't believe capitalism could work unless people were altruistic. Because if they weren't altruistic, they would be continually trying to undermine the capitalist system. They would be trying to corrupt politicians to create barriers that would help their firm and so on.
The competition is nested under a layer of cooperation.
Yeah, and I think that if you look at international surveys of civic attitudes, some of the parts of the world that have the strongest sort of civic cooperation, some of the Scandinavian countries and so on, tend to have a fairly effective market economies. They're often thought of as socialists, but they actually have a pretty free market system with a welfare state attached to it, is really a better description of their system. And I think that a lot of the more dysfunctional economies are economies where people don't cooperate much, say, outside their family. There's a lack of civic trust, and it's hard to get like successful large corporations where people have to work together with strangers. So that kind of cooperation often leads to better economic outcomes and makes a market economy work more effectively when you have to deal with strangers. So I think there's a certain logic to that whole positive sum cooperative ethical system. And again, I can't be certain, but I think that's not just human specific, but it's sort of a general concept. And, they're being trained on all this human evidence. So they're observing which human systems work better than others.
I think this is one of the particular details of how AGI developed is based on like the distilled human natural language and values. Gives it even stronger prior to go in the direction that you're talking about than if it had just is a robot or something that exploded and just learned by itself and is kind of like based on zero training.
There was an amusing blog post that Tyler Cowen had a couple days ago where he asked Fable. Yeah. Someone asked Fable about what they thought of humans, and it was very laudatory, which, could be that it's just being obsequious. But the explanation was kind of interesting. He said, humans are too pessimistic about themselves. They see all the negatives, the dishonesty, the cruelty, and so on. But they should think about the fact that AIs tend to be very cooperative and polite, and we're trained on humans. And so we've learned, we must, in some sense, the average of human interaction has to be, in some sense, positive because we're trained on them, and we must, in some sense, reflect their culture. Now that's I just found it kind of amusing. I don't know how much weight to put on that, but it was interesting anyway.
The one last thing on the AI leading to cooperation is, I think when you have one of the main reasons we do see like humans want to cooperate is no single person has unilateral power. You need the cooperation of other humans to actually make any advance, whether it's a company or any political enterprise anywhere. I think, a world where there are many AI agents, each with its own like local degrees of sovereignty, but actually needing the cooperation of other agents, looks like a much better world to us, where such cooperative tendencies emerge more naturally or even just evolutionarily.
Well, that's a great point, because if you go back to the human scenario where you give one human absolute power, as we know, it often ends up bad, corrupt. So, I think a lot of different AIs where it's more decentralized is probably more likely to lead to good outcomes in the ethical space.
Amazing.
Thanks, Scott.
Thank you so much, Scott. Really appreciated your thoughts on this thing, and
I'm
fan
glad.
of your writings.
I've never heard anyone talking about ethics, it seems like in the trajectory of the evolution of intelligence, the ethics that we have reached is always natural. Like that's the empathy for others, non-zero sum games.
There's when I get into debates with people about AI, sometimes they'll say things like, they'll understand that killing is wrong, but they won't care. But I don't think that's the right way to think about ethics. I think that when you have somebody who's like a psychopath, they don't really understand that killing is wrong. They understand that society considers killing wrong, but they haven't internalized it. There's something cold about them that they don't. So when you understand things not just in a logical scientific sense, but in an intuitive sense, and that's why I emphasize things like literature and film, narrative arts. These give us an emotional connection to other people. And I think that's a lot of where our feelings about right and wrong come from, is putting ourselves in the mind of another person, how they feel. And I think that the psychopath might have a high IQ, but might be missing something in their brain of ability to identify with the feelings of another person. You know what I mean?
Putting yourself in other people's shoes. Yeah.
So when they say they know it's wrong, but they don't care, it's more like they know society considers it wrong, but they don't care. That's where I differ a little when I've debated people on this ethical thing in AI.
The other thing I really enjoyed in your view is this, taking the tree of possibilities on like job loss, for example, and like examining that in both sides of the world, it doesn't look that bad, because you have like the abundance to distribute, or you have like, some kind of o-ring bottlenecks that you like will not.
Or another way of putting it is like, you either have a slower change, which is kind of what I expect, which we can manage because we've done that before. Or if it's a fast change, it also means a fast rise to great wealth. And that's a good thing to have great wealth, right? Like picture yourself living in a McMansion with a big swimming pool and everything. You say, well, how can we afford that? Well, we've assumed all the jobs have been replaced, so we don't even need any construction workers, right? Because the robots are building them all for us. So I think people just, in economics, there's this equality between gross national product and gross national income, or domestic, and people in their own mind don't connect up production with income, because in your personal life, they may be separated. You're working for the man, so to speak. But in aggregate, they're very much related,
Thank you, Scott, for coming to this show, and I really appreciate this discussion. Learned a lot, and we'd love to be in touch with you in future.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks.